At exactly 2 a.m., the phone beside Victor Hale's bed began to ring, and when he saw his secretary's name on the screen, he almost ignored it. But the next second, something inside him changed. Eleanor Whitmore had never called him outside working hours in 12 years, not once, not even during the worst crises his criminal empire had faced. When Victor finally answered, he heard only a trembling breath before Eleanor whispered that she was in the hospital, that her heart had suddenly stopped, and that the doctors were fighting to bring her back. The most feared man in the city said nothing. He simply stood, grabbed his coat, and left. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a meaningful comment, and subscribe to our channel so our community can continue sharing stories that remind us that even the hardest hearts can change. By the time morning sunlight began spilling across the hospital windows, Victor Hale was already sitting alone in a narrow waiting room, his expensive coat folded over the back of a chair and his hands locked together so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. The city knew Victor as a man who never showed fear. His name was spoken carefully in restaurants, offices, police stations, and back rooms where people made decisions they did not want connected to themselves. He controlled shipping companies, nightclubs, construction firms, and several businesses that existed mostly to hide the money flowing beneath them. Men twice his size lowered their voices when he entered a room. Rivals disappeared from his world through lawsuits, intimidation, or quiet deals that nobody discussed. But none of that mattered in the hospital. There, he was simply a man waiting for news about the one person who had stayed beside him when everyone else had learned to fear him. Eleanor Whitmore had worked for Victor for 12 years. She was 58, disciplined, practical, and almost impossible to impress. She had organized his schedule, protected his privacy, corrected his mistakes, and occasionally reminded him that being powerful did not make him right. When Victor first hired her, she had been a widowed mother struggling to keep her small apartment and pay for her son's medical treatment. Victor had offered her a salary that changed her life, but Eleanor had never treated him like a savior. She treated him like an employer who needed someone willing to tell him the truth. Over the years, she became the closest thing he had to family. She knew when he was angry, when he was lying, and when he was pretending not to care. The doctors eventually came through the doors and told Victor that Eleanor had survived the emergency, but her condition remained serious. She needed surgery and several weeks of recovery. Victor listened without interrupting, then quietly asked about the costs. The doctor explained that Eleanor's insurance would cover much of the treatment, but there were additional expenses and a long rehabilitation ahead. Victor immediately offered to pay everything. The doctor thanked him, but Victor was already walking away. For the first time in years, money was not enough to make him feel powerful. When Eleanor woke later that morning, she found Victor sitting beside her bed. She looked surprised to see him there, especially because he had never visited employees in the hospital unless there was business involved. Victor remained silent for several seconds before finally telling her that she had frightened him. Eleanor studied his face and noticed something she had never seen before. He looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally emptied. She gently told him that she had spent 12 years watching him build walls around himself, and she wondered how long he intended to live behind them. Victor looked toward the window instead of answering. That conversation stayed with him as the day continued. While Eleanor rested, Victor returned to his office, where several of his associates were waiting for instructions. A shipment had been delayed, a rival had begun moving into one of his territories, and one of his senior men had been caught stealing from a company account. Normally Victor would have dealt with all three problems before lunch. Instead, he sat behind his desk staring at the city outside his window. For the first time, the empire he had spent 20 years building looked strangely small. Victor had not become ruthless because he was born without a heart. His childhood had taught him that kindness could be dangerous. His father had abandoned the family when Victor was young, leaving his mother to raise him while working 2 jobs. Victor remembered watching landlords threaten her, creditors insult her, and people promise help before disappearing. As a teenager, he learned that people respected strength more than honesty. By his 30s, he had turned that lesson into a philosophy. He believed compassion made people vulnerable and forgiveness made them weak. Every betrayal became another reason to build a taller wall. But Eleanor had always challenged that belief. Years earlier, when Victor's younger brother Adrian had died in an accident, Eleanor had been the only person who stayed in the office after everyone else left. Victor had refused to attend the funeral because he could not bear seeing his brother's coffin. Eleanor had not forced him. She simply sat outside his office until morning and left a cup of coffee on his desk. She never mentioned it afterward. Victor had remembered it for 12 years. That afternoon, while Victor was reviewing hospital paperwork, an envelope arrived at his office. It contained financial records from one of his companies and a handwritten note from Eleanor. The note explained that she had discovered irregular payments months earlier. She had been quietly investigating them because she believed someone inside Victor's organization was stealing from him. She had never told him because she wanted proof before accusing anyone. The documents revealed something far more serious than simple theft. One of Victor's most trusted associates, Marcus Vane, had been secretly transferring money from several companies and using Victor's name to threaten people who tried to expose him. Victor stared at the papers for a long time. Marcus had been with him for 15 years. He had handled difficult negotiations, protected Victor during dangerous disputes, and convinced Victor that loyalty was the most valuable currency in their world. Yet the evidence was undeniable. For the first time, Victor understood something painful. The people he trusted had learned to imitate his cruelty because that was the language he had taught them. He had created an empire where fear was rewarded, deception was expected, and kindness was considered weakness. Now one of the few genuinely loyal people in his life was lying in a hospital bed because she had been carrying burdens he should have carried himself. Victor summoned Marcus that afternoon. He did not shout. He did not threaten him. He simply placed the documents on the desk and asked him to explain. Marcus tried to deny everything, but Victor already knew the truth. When Marcus finally admitted what he had done, he expected punishment. Instead, Victor told him that he would face the legal consequences of his actions and that every stolen dollar would be traced and recovered through legitimate channels. Marcus looked confused because he had expected violence. Victor only told him that he was finished allowing his anger to decide the future. That decision shocked everyone around him. Over the following days, Victor began changing the way his companies operated. He ordered independent audits, removed corrupt managers, created legal protections for employees who reported wrongdoing, and began closing the businesses that depended on intimidation. Some associates left immediately. Others called him weak. A few threatened to destroy what he had built. Victor did not retaliate. He simply continued dismantling the parts of his empire that had been poisoning his life. But the hardest conversation was still waiting for him. Eleanor eventually became strong enough to sit in a wheelchair and take a short walk through the hospital garden. Victor pushed the chair slowly beneath the trees while sunlight warmed the path. Eleanor asked him what had happened to the organization while she was recovering. Victor told her he was changing it. She smiled because she had known for years that the man capable of change was still somewhere inside him. Then Eleanor revealed something she had never told him. Her son, Matthew, had once worked for Victor. He had left the company after witnessing a violent confrontation and had spent years believing his mother was helping a man who destroyed lives. Eleanor admitted that she had stayed because she believed Victor was not beyond saving. She had seen the wounded young man beneath the hardened businessman. She had hoped one day he would see him too. Victor stopped pushing the wheelchair. He admitted that he had spent most of his life believing people were either useful or dangerous. Eleanor had been the first person to prove there was another category, people who stayed because they cared. He apologized for every time he had frightened her, every time he had made her carry problems that belonged to him, and every time his world had placed her in danger. Eleanor reached for his hand. She did not tell him that everything was forgiven because some wounds could not disappear overnight. Instead, she told him that forgiveness was not pretending the past never happened. It was choosing not to let the past control what came next. Those words changed Victor more than any threat ever had. Months passed. Eleanor recovered slowly, and Victor remained involved in her rehabilitation. He paid her medical expenses, but more importantly, he stopped treating her as an employee and began treating her as the friend she had always been. He sold several companies and used the money to establish a foundation supporting families facing financial emergencies and children who had lost parents. He also began meeting with people his organization had once intimidated, offering restitution where possible and accepting that some people would never forgive him. One of those people was Matthew. When Victor finally met Eleanor's son, he expected anger. Matthew did not disappoint him. He told Victor that his mother had spent years protecting a man who had never deserved her loyalty. Victor could have defended himself. Instead, he admitted that Matthew was right. He told him that he could not erase the past, but he could spend the rest of his life making different choices. Matthew did not forgive him that day. But he shook his hand. For Victor, that was enough. A year later, the man who had once terrified an entire city walked through the doors of the hospital carrying a small box of pastries for Eleanor. She was sitting in the garden, healthy enough to walk without assistance. Victor sat beside her, and they watched families move through the sunlight. Children laughed near the fountain while parents pushed strollers along the path. Eleanor asked Victor whether he missed the old life. Victor looked at the people around him and smiled faintly. He told her that for years he had confused being feared with being respected and confused being rich with being successful. Now he understood that a person could own everything and still have nothing if there was nobody they could call when their heart was breaking. Eleanor reminded him that she had called him at 2 a.m. because she knew he would come. Victor looked down at his hands and quietly admitted that the call had saved more than her life. It had saved his. He had spent decades building an empire so nobody could hurt him, only to discover that the walls protecting his heart had also trapped him inside. Eleanor's emergency had forced him to walk through the door he had kept locked for years. He learned that strength was not always about controlling people. Sometimes strength was admitting you were wrong. Sometimes it was walking away from revenge. Sometimes it was paying for the damage you caused. And sometimes it was simply showing up for someone when they needed you. Before the story ends, ask yourself what you would do if you were given a second chance to repair something you once believed was beyond saving. Would you choose pride, or would you choose forgiveness? Would you continue carrying old anger, or would you finally put it down? Leave a meaningful comment and share what this story taught you about kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And perhaps the greatest lesson Victor Hale ever learned was not written in a business contract, spoken in a courtroom, or enforced by fear. It was learned in a quiet hospital garden beneath ordinary daylight, when a woman who had every reason to walk away chose to give him one more chance to become the man he should have been all along. Sometimes the person who saves us does not rescue us from danger. Sometimes they simply remind us that we are still capable of becoming better. Sometimes one phone call is enough to wake a sleeping heart. And sometimes the second chance we think we are giving someone else is actually the second chance we have been waiting to give ourselves.